conference room, a very warm welcome to this webinar on the Myanmar crisis. Where do we go from here? I'm Sihasak Pongketgal, Secretary General to the Asian Peace and Reconciliation Council, and I have the privilege to be the moderator for this session. This event is co-organized by the Asian Peace and Reconciliation Council, APRC, and the Faculty of Political Science of Ramkhamhaeng University. As you know, it's been 3 weeks since the military in Myanmar seized power on February 1st, detained Aung San Suu Kyi and other leaders of the NLD, declared a state of emergency, promising an election within a year. The military coup has sparked widespread protests and civil disobedience throughout the country and has sent shockwaves around the world. We know what happened and how it happened, but looking ahead, what does the future hold for the people of Myanmar and democracy in Myanmar? How to prevent the eruption of violence, and what are the prospects for advancing peaceful dialogue? Now, the international community cannot be just bystanders, and how should countries, particularly the major powers like the United States, respond? Apart from pressures and sanctions, can diplomacy play a role? So the question, and diplomatically, the onus seems to be on ASEAN to take a leading role and demonstrate its much touted centrality. So the question before us is, where do we go from here? How will the Myanmar crisis evolve? And especially in our session, we would like to focus on the implications for the role of the international community, particularly the role of ASEAN going forward. Now, to discuss these and other relevant issues, we have invited a number of eminent panelists, each having different perspectives to share, but all of them sharing deep concern about what's happening in Myanmar and wishing to contribute ideas and thinking on the challenges Myanmar is facing. I will introduce each of the 7 panelists when it comes to their turn to speak. I do wish to make one important clarification. There have been comments criticizing the organizers for not inviting any speaker from Myanmar. We certainly take heed of your comments, and on behalf of the organizers, I would like to point out that we had, from the very beginning, approached 2 very eminent speakers from Myanmar, one of whom a woman. Unfortunately, they had to decline our invitation for reason that the sensitivity of the current situation made it necessary for them to avoid making public statements or interviews for the time being. Now, be that as it may, we look forward to comments, viewpoints, and perspectives from all of those participating, whether online or in this conference room. Now, before we proceed with the discussion, I would like to invite our co-chairs, the chairman of APRC, Dr. Surukit Sathyanthai, former Deputy Prime Minister and Foreign Minister of Thailand, and Assistant Professor Dr. Sathin Sunthornpan, Dean of the Political Science Faculty of Ramkhamhaeng University, to give their opening remarks. Dr. Surukit.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Sihasak, Secretary General to the Asian Peace and Reconciliation Council. I'd just like to take this opportunity, first of all, to thank our co-organizer, the Faculty of Political Science, Ramkhamhaeng University in Bangkok, Thailand, especially Professor Dr. Sathin, the Dean of the faculty, in organizing, providing all the technologies, including the auditorium, for us to make this webinar possible. Thank you very much also all lead speakers in participating in this webinar of APRC and Faculty of Political Science, Ramkhamhaeng University, on this very important question. As you all know, on the 1st of February, APRC, Asian Peace and Reconciliation Council, has issued a shared statement on the situation and developments in Myanmar. In short, we have called for the release of Aung San Suu Kyi and those currently under detention. We have asked Myanmar and all sides concerned to uphold the principles of democracy and the rule of law as enshrined in the ASEAN Charter and also in the Constitution of Myanmar, and for all concerned parties to engage in peaceful dialogue and reconciliation. So that's basically the content of the shared statement of APRC. I have 5 points to make and 2 suggestions and food for thoughts for this afternoon. First of all, I would like to reiterate the call for an immediate return to democracy, release of Aung San Suu Kyi and those illegally retained, and a call for Myanmar military to exercise utmost restraint to avoid the use of force, and that no violence is used against peaceful protesters. Casualties and loss of lives in the past week have raised greatest concern among many of the ASEAN family members and the international community. Secondly, I would like to encourage ASEAN, and especially Thailand, to play a proactive role in convincing Myanmar military to return the country to democracy as soon as possible. If ASEAN does not take the matter in their own hands, others may inevitably come in to play a role. It should not be desirable for both ASEAN and Myanmar to allow extra regional players to take up this matter. 3. Since the Security Council of the United Nations has attached importance to the role of ASEAN in this matter, as reflected in the chair statement of the UNSC, ASEAN should look at the situation in Myanmar as an important ASEAN issue. ASEAN should look at crisis in Myanmar as the one undermining the core principles of ASEAN as spelled out in the ASEAN Charter. It is therefore incumbent upon ASEAN to assist its member to come out of the crisis peacefully and to observe the principles enshrined in the ASEAN Charter, that is democracy, human rights, and fundamental freedom. 4. ASEAN should work closely with the international community to create communication with Myanmar military to put utmost restraints on the use of force and violence with the protesters, and should come forward to immediately roll out a roadmap for democracy and roadmap for national reconciliation. Fifthly, the targeted sanction or the lack of sanction, but a wait-and-see attitude of the international business community and the dysfunctioning of the government due to protests against military takeover from all professions, especially the civil disobedience, will aggravate the economic hardship faced by the majority of Myanmar people, especially the poor people. The conflict and disagreement of the military role from ethnic armed groups will add to the unpredictable security situation affecting both Myanmar and the neighboring countries. It is therefore very important for ASEAN to put its concerted efforts to convince Myanmar military of what is called now the State Administration Council, SAC, to come up with the 2 roadmaps as soon as possible so that the atmosphere for trade and investment will not deteriorate much further. Excellencies and friends, I have 2 suggestions for the way forward as fruitful thoughts. In order for the road to democracy to be sustainable, there should be two major steps to be taken. First, there must be a roadmap for democracy. The roadmap must roll out clear steps and timeline to be taken to return to democracy. This is important to create acceptance and cooperation from both the domestic and international communities. Two, there must be a roadmap for national reconciliation. This roadmap is key to return to normalcy in Myanmar and to lessen conflicts and protest in the country. A deliberative dialogue with NLD, with democratic advocates, including youth representatives, is essential to ensure that peace and stability will prevail and that Myanmar can continue to work with international economic community, both from the public and the private sector. It is my strong view that a dialogue among parties to the conflict, either through quiet diplomacy or other means, is the only way forward that unrest in Myanmar will be de-escalated. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Surakit. Thank you for sharing your thoughts on the situation in Myanmar and also your suggestions on the way forward. I'm sure that on some of these issues we'll have the chance to come back and have in-depth discussions later on. And now I'd like to give the floor to our other co-chair, Dr. Satin Sunthornpan, the Dean of the Political Science Faculty of Ram-Khamhaeng University, for his opening remarks. Dr. Satin.
Yes, thank you. On behalf of the Faculty of Political Science, Ram-Khamhaeng University in Thailand, it is great honor to welcome Professor Dr. Surakit Tianthai, Ambassador Sihasak Phongketkaew, Mr. Raleigh Jagan, and distinguished guest speaker, colleague, and all participants from many countries who join here to exchange your view, experience, and work together with the Asian Peace and Reconciliation Council, or the APRC, on the topic of a Myanmar crisis. Where do we go from here? The Faculty of the Political Science, Ram-Khamhaeng University, have signed the MOU with the APRC for years to cooperate for promoting the work related especially on the Peace and Reconciliation Councils. Due to the COVID-19, this year we have a privilege to co-host with the APRC of holding this first webinar, and I hope we will organize this kind of even more in the future. I wish to express thanks to all speakers for accepting our invitations. I recognize that all speakers have taken their valuable times and the effort to contribute to these seminars. As we know that military coups that happened in Myanmar began on February the 1st. This makes for the international community is deeply concerned with the crisis happening in Myanmar. The Tatmadaw, or the military force, seeks the power after overthrowing the elected government led by the state councillor and Minister of Foreign Affairs, Aung San Suu Kyi. The military proclaimed a year-long state of emergency and declared powers have been raised to the General Min Aung Hlaing, the chairman of the State Administration Council of Myanmar, a position which makes him de facto leader of the country. He reinforced the military rules and martial laws, ending nearly 10 years period of civilian rules from March 2011 to the February this year. Even the Myanmar just finished its latest election, as we know, in last November. And NLD won the landslide victory with the absolute majority seats in the parliament. But the military declared the result of the November 2020 general election invalid and state its intent to hold a new election at the end of the state of emergencies. And right now, President Win Min, Aung San Suu Kyi were detained along with the Minister their deputies, and the member of the parliaments. So this brings us to the webinar today about where do we go from here in the Myanmar crisis. I believe that today we have many details to talk, especially about what will happen in Myanmar during the state of emergency this year. And after 1 year, we will see the election in Myanmar as the military mentions, or we will see the extension of the state of democracy, the state of emergency again. So I wish you all very fruitful discussion, and I look forward to this event to build a concrete way to raise the awareness and to seek the answer how to maintain peace and stability in the crisis within Myanmar and among other countries in the terms of international relations in order to handle the crisis now and in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Satin. Before I invite our speakers to take the floor, I just wanted to point out that in this initial round of remarks, we have between 7 to 8 minutes for each speaker, and then we hope to have interactive discussions, and then open the floor for comments and questions from participants in the audience. Now, I'd like to start off with His Excellency Jose Ramos-Horta. His Excellency led the struggle of his country for independence and democracy. He served as President of Timor-Leste from 2007 to 2012. I think he has seen Timor-Leste gone through conflict and then renewal and reconciliation. So, Your Excellency, of course, the situation in each country is different, but what are your thoughts on the democratic struggle in Myanmar and the challenges of achieving a democracy that is sustainable? Your Excellency. I think you have to unmute first. You're on mute right now.
Sorry. Thank you. Greetings, warmest greetings to you all. Well, every time there is a coup, and we do not condemn, we call for a dialogue, for reconciliation, we set a precedent. Every time we call on a usurpers of power, because they didn't like the election result. The military in Myanmar never liked the result of every free democratic election result that happened over the last 20 years in Myanmar. They imprisoned Suu Kyi, they imprisoned all other democratic leaders. And we do not condemn. If this were in Africa, following a military coup, the African Union, the Continental Organization, and regional organizations would immediately suspend membership of the country concerned and would not say wishy-washy statements of as soon as possible return to democracy. They demand and they impose sanctions. If it were in Latin America, with the Organization of African Latin American States, the same would happen. Obviously, not to mention Europe. But in Asia, we got used to military usurping power. Then they orchestrate a new constitution. They ban political parties left and right. They imprison. They orchestrate an election. They still didn't like it. They arrest the new prime minister until they get the result they want. We are familiar with that. We are also familiar that the military are not able in the day and age to impose fait accompli. We saw it in Indonesia in 98, 99. People went to the streets in far more difficult situations than in Myanmar today. We saw 20 years earlier in the Philippines when the people went to the streets and brought down the Marcos dictatorship. And we saw in Myanmar time and again, and we've seen in Thailand also in the last many years. So the issue for me is the military underestimated the charisma, the power, the legitimacy of Suu Kyi. They orchestrated a vicious war on the Rohingya, hoping it would draw Suu Kyi to condemn the violence on the Rohingya. Then they would manipulate the hardline ethno-nationalist Buddhist monks, and within days you would have hundreds of thousands of people in the streets protesting against Suu Kyi. Suu Kyi played very carefully throughout the 5 years. She knew she was in a precarious condition vis-a-vis the military. She had to buy time. She tried to consolidate power. Some analysts, when I was last in Myanmar 2-3 years ago, were saying how the military were viewed as the defenders of Myanmar territorial integrity, sovereignty against hardline Muslims and so on and so on. And Suu Kyi would suffer from that. The people in Myanmar would see the military. And that's what the military were counting on. When with Suu Kyi being ostracized internationally, all accolades taken off, the military thought Suu Kyi is isolated internationally. They had a chance. So they went to this election. Well, the people of Myanmar gave Suu Kyi an even bigger mandate than before. I have to say, of course, diplomacy has a part. I commend President Joe Biden of the United States, the European Union, for the principle, the strong stance they are taking. But this does not exclude, obviously, diplomatic démarches. But the military in Myanmar have to learn, like the military in Indonesia, in the Philippines, in Thailand, the time of military rule across Asia, across Africa, Latin America is over. They should go back to barracks and let the civilians run the country. And so what shall we do? We have to at least offer moral political support to Suu Kyi and to all people in Myanmar right now demonstrating. So that's my comment for today.
Thank you, Your Excellency. Now I'd like to turn to Mr. Larry Jagan, a journalist and former correspondent of the BBC. He's been following developments in Myanmar for a long time and written much about the evolution of democracy in that country. Larry, how do you see the situation in Myanmar unfolding, and what do you anticipate to be the possible scenarios as we look ahead?
Well, I think before we actually look at what the scenarios are ahead, we need to look at not the history of where we've got here, but the underlying causes. I agree that dialogue and reconciliation are really the only way forward. And unfortunately, to some extent, we're in this position because of lack of dialogue and reconciliation over the last 30 years, even in the 5 years of the NLD government. And I think we have to get out of looking at this as about Aung San Suu Kyi. Aung San Suu Kyi's role since she returned to Myanmar in 1987 has been crucial. She's been an inspiration and she's made incredible sacrifices. But actually, we've moved into a new stage by what's happening in Myanmar today. And I mean today, the 22nd of the 2nd, 2021, the 5-2s. We're seeing a new aspiration being voiced for democracy. Not necessarily a return to NLD government, although they're seen as an important part of the future. And I think that's what we need to sort of keep in mind. The most important thing that's happening today is millions and millions of people and I mean that literally. I'm getting photos from small villages, from towns throughout the country, because it's a general strike. And they're out on the streets demanding a return to democracy, respect the elections, and of course, release the leaders. But the majority leading this in terms of being in the front line are young people. This is what we sort of euphemistically call Generation Z. And they are taking the movement to a new level that we didn't see in the election. This is a new debate about where democracy, the future of democracy in this country is going to go. And I think we need to understand what's motivating them. Sure, there is a split within the civil disobedience movement that grew up in response to immediately to the coup, those who support the NLD, but there are those who have felt the NLD had failed them in pushing democratic reform forward, and they are just as much in the forefront of this group, Generation Z. So any mediation, any dialogue in the future has to involve them. That's going to be complicated because they're deliberately leaderless in the sense that they don't have one person who's leading. It's a bit like democratic guerrilla warfare in terms of protests. But they are an essential part of anything that happens in the future and any dialogue that is to take place. I think we also need to understand the military's motivation. Many people have said this is Min Aung Hlaing's political ambitions to be president. That is misjudging what the military are on about. If it had only been about his ambition, the army would not have supported him, because what's important to the military is not a single person, although they take their command from a single commander. It's the institution of the military. It's the institution of the army, and that's what we have to understand. When Aung San Suu Kyi won the election in 2015, it wasn't until the middle of March, 2016, that she knew that she was going to be allowed to govern. She had to get the consent of Tan Shui, the old man, and the military before she could form a government at the end of March. That's why, in many ways, the NLD government of that period were really on the back foot, because all the preparation time that they should have had, they didn't, because it was negotiations of whether they're going to be allowed to form a government. The military had their vision of what was going to happen. They don't trust people, or civilians certainly, and they misread the mood of the country, thinking that actually. In fact, not many, but some of my military contacts told me in the first 12 months of Aung San Suu Kyi's government, she's going to fail. She's going to come to us within a year and ask for us to join in a government of a national coalition, just like 1958, where UNU had to ask Ne Win to intervene. That was their image at the time. She didn't fail. And then, of course, they thought this was going to be a hung parliament. Sure, the NLD would win a lot of seats, but there would be ethnic parties, other pro-military parties, other democratic parties, and the military could then somehow exert its influence on the political structure. And as we know, that didn't happen. Aung San Suu Kyi and the NLD had an even greater majority than they had in 2015. So unfortunately at the time, I think Aung San Suu Kyi saw this as a mandate from heaven. She didn't need the military. She did not need their consent. And I think there ought to have been some kind of discussion at that time which didn't take place. I think also what people don't understand, and the military didn't, and unfortunately nor did the NLD, the victory in the election was not necessarily a victory for the NLD or a victory for Aung San Suu Kyi. because I was stuck in Bangkok covering the elections from here, I had a network of stringers. I call them stringers. They're really friends and unpaid helpers who I had taught journalism in the 5 years ago in Myanmar. Others that I have been teaching. They went out and interviewed people. Now it wasn't an academic interview or statistically verifiable. The majority of people said they would vote 85% for the NLD. But when asked why are they voting for the NLD, a very small percentage of them said Masu. Most of them because it's a start. We want to see a federal democratic state. And no one is going to help us get that without the NLD. That was the aspirations even when they voted for the NLD. And I think we need to remember that. The military don't appreciate that. They had their fixed views. The hung parliament didn't work, so they got spurious ideas about election fraud. I think one has to understand what the military are looking for is a return to the roadmap that my colleague here, Dr. Surikit, helped devise for Myanmar, that the Prime Minister at the time, Khin Yunt, rolled out in 2003. They want to return to that because the final stage of the roadmap, before they trust people for a proper democracy, was some form of national coalition government, where the military would have a central role within a permanent structure. Their view, and that's why they talk about permanent multi-party democracy. They don't mean multi-party democracy. They mean sectional parties. They don't want to see a party that is dominant. They don't want to see a party that is going to rival their power. It's what I call pluralist democracy. And that's what they're trying to turn it back to now. And they're already talking national coalition or rather a government of national coalition. We're going to bring in the ethnic minorities. We're looking for other partners. I mean, they're doing that now, but they're not very successful. I think the ethnic minorities, those that signed the ceasefire agreements, message to the government just before the weekend, our support is with the civil disobedience movement. We're not going to talk to you anymore. We're not going to negotiate. Is a real slap in the face to the military, but they won't see it that way. They, as a typical military, they have begun on a strategic roadmap of their own. They have got military orders, and they're not going to stop until they're ordered differently. So unfortunately, I believe at this point in time, actually trying to negotiate with the military is premature. That's not to say that sometime in the future, when things really become unstuck, and hopefully not violently, then the international community needs to be in a position where they can intervene in some way or other. In the meantime, sanctions have to be implemented of some sort or other, targeted sanctions against the military. Make sure that what is targeted is the military, economic businesses and so on, and not the poor. And that is difficult with sanctions. At some stage, we ought to be able to quietly negotiate. Unfortunately, in the past, a lot of the negotiations that took place, both with Dr. Surikit and with the UN envoy at the time, Razali Ismail, the regime saw as megaphone diplomacy. If any mediation in the future is to work, it has to be quiet, confidential mediation, in the same way that Norway has been so successful, seemed to be at the time in the Middle East. It's that kind of move that needs to be. And it needs to be ASEAN-based. The military are not going to listen to anyone outside the region. And of course, ASEAN needs to liaise and coordinate with China. China is really very influential in terms of the ethnic groups along the border. We keep talking about how integrated China is into the economy of Myanmar, and all that is true. But their real power is the groups in the north. I've always harbored the view, and I suspect at the moment I may be proved wrong, that actually an ASEAN initiative, Thai-led, with Japan is the way forward. But at the moment, there is no traction within the military. I spoke to some of my military sources on the weekend in terms of trying to see what was going to happen on Monday. And these are people I have known for 10, some 20 years. And there is a hard attitude now than there's ever been before. In fact, it's very clear they did not want me to contact them again to discuss these things, which for 10 years we've talked very openly. They are hardline. And I said, well, what can I wait for? What kinds of signs am I going to see for change? And they said, you wait a year and there'll be elections. But at those elections, I'm afraid, the NLD, if nothing is done, will be banned. They will not be able to compete. It's going to be a 2010, a replica of 2010. And so I'm fairly pessimistic. But if there is enough stranglehold or constraints put on the country as a whole by the regional community, or regional countries, then we may be able to encourage them to open up to dialogue. And I think absolutely the way forward is not through diplomats or politicians. It's through the armies, the army commanders in the region, and obviously particularly Thailand. They have direct lines to Min Aung Hlaing. They are of the like mind in many ways. They're the only ones, I believe, in the short term that can initiate some kind of contact that may evolve into mediation. Thank you.
Thank you, Larry. Now we have Ambassador Christian Lechervy. He's the French ambassador to Myanmar. He's been posted there since 2018. I'm sure, Ambassador Lechervy, you've been witness to events firsthand and reporting on developments to your country. I understand that the EU is meeting today to decide on steps to be taken in response to the military coup. Of course, there are calls for sanctions and pressures. Now, in your view, how should the international community respond in a way that will contribute to resolving the current challenges and upholding democracy in Myanmar? Ambassador Lechervy? See, I think we have some problem with the internet connection with Yang Kong right now. So perhaps we'll go to the next speaker, and then maybe Ambassador Lechervy could join us later on. I'd like to invite His Excellency Jose Isidro Camacho, a former Finance Minister of the Philippines and a well-known and respected figure in the region's business community. I'm sure you've been following developments in the regional economies, including Myanmar. How do you see the economic impact of the Myanmar crisis, particularly the confidence of the foreign business community and investors?
Yes, thank you very much, Ambassador Siasak. Good afternoon to everyone. A pleasure but a sadness to be participating in this webinar. Of course, I've been observing what's happening in Myanmar, and it's very sad, particularly with the escalation of violence. When I reflect upon the potential impact of what's currently happening to its economy and the perception of foreign investors, one thing that I tried to do was to track back and say, how was the economy of Myanmar performing as it went on a road towards democracy? Looking back, so that perhaps that could give us a clue as to what to expect looking forward. And I guess I would go to the recent history of its journey towards greater democracy until these recent events of the last few weeks. When 2010, when the government called for an election, unfortunately, the civilian political parties did not participate. They boycotted in 2010. In 2012, there were by-elections. The NLD participated, and they won overwhelmingly, taking 43 out of the 45 seats that were then contested. And then, of course, in 2015, that landslide victory led by Aung San Suu Kyi and the NLD, where they took 86% of the seats in the parliament. Looking back at those years and looking at how the economy performed and the different aspects of the economy, it's very clear that, as they progressed towards democracy, things started looking better. When you look at, for example, of exports and the yearly exports of Myanmar in 2010 was roughly a little over $8 billion. By 2019, that's almost doubled to about $15.6 billion in 2019. If you look at the response of the foreign direct investments, as again democracy progressed in Myanmar, you also see a very similar trend. Quarterly, or rather the annual FDI, or foreign direct investments in 2010 in Myanmar, was about $1 billion. By 2017, it's 4 times, or about $4 billion. So you see a significant influx of foreign indirect investments. Another significant contributor to the economy of Myanmar is tourism. In 2010, they received, they welcomed some 790,000 tourists. By 2013, that's more than doubled to about 2 million. And by 2019, that's quadrupled to $4.4 billion. Together with these economic indicators, you also can look at some of the indices that indicate the perception towards what's going on in Myanmar. I looked at 2 things that many foreign investors looked at. One is the corruption index, which the Transparency International organization tracks. In 2010, Myanmar ranked 180th in the world among all the countries that was measured by Transparency International. By 2019, they've already improved to 130th. So that's a jump of 50 countries in a span of 9 years. In the Ease of Doing Business Index that's tracked by the World Bank, similarly, in 2014, Myanmar was ranking 177th in the world. By 2019, it has improved to 160th. So clearly, on its road to democracy, you've seen significant improvements, not only in the aspects of the economy, but especially in the perception of businessmen and investors into the country. And this is really reflected in the way its economy performed. Prior to this road towards democracy in 2008, Myanmar grew by 3.6%, a very modest growth in the economy, especially in the ASEAN region, where you have the likes of Vietnam, Indonesia, Philippines growing in excess of 6%. In the period 2009 to 2011, as it called for its first election, the economy averaged a growth of a little over 5%. So it's an improvement, as segments of the economy started performing and investments started coming in from overseas. After the 2012 elections, where the NLD won 43 out of 45 seats that were contested, you see the economy of Myanmar peaking, growing at an average of about 7.4% in the period 2012 to 2015. After the landslide victory in 2015, you see the economy really stabilizing, and growth was registered 6.4% average GDP growth from 2016 to 2019. So it's very clear, the trend is very clear that on its road towards democracy, its economy was performing. Now, I think as we project what might happen going forward, it's very clear. I mean, if you're reversing everything that you've done to improve your economy, you should expect that the reverse would happen. The economy would suffer. Foreign investors would lose faith in the economy, lose faith in the sanctity of contracts, of the stability of government policies, and so on and so forth. And we shouldn't forget, of course, that the economy of Myanmar is already reeling from the damage that's been brought about by COVID-19. Right? I mean, from its growth rate of over 6% in the last 3 years, the ADB is forecasting that 2020 would register a decline to 1.8% GDP growth. The World Bank, even worse, 0.5% GDP growth in 2020. We'll see what the numbers will show when the government comes out with the numbers. But again, these are clear indicators, right? So I'm sorry to say that if things were to continue the way they are, escalate further, if violence were to escalate, if sanctions were to be imposed by the major economies around the world, the US, Europe, and parts of Asia in particular, I would expect a very sudden deterioration of what is already a very damaged economy in Myanmar. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We have Ambassador Lechervy online now. Ambassador, you are there in Yangon reporting to your government, and I understand today the EU is meeting to decide on steps to be taken in response to the military coup. Ambassador, in your view, how should the international community be responding constructively to what's happening in Myanmar? Ambassador Lechervy? Apparently we lost our connection. Oh, Ambassador Lechervy, please.
You heard me?
Yes, we hear you well.
Okay. Good afternoon. I am a very bad internet connection in the time being, but I would like to warmly thank APRC for this seminar. I feel it's the first one in Asia and Southeast Asia about this matter. In the present moment, like in this case, more than 300 cities are affected daily by mass demonstrations. The capital, Naypyidaw, is experiencing exceptional mobilizations. The protest is expressed in the very heart of the state, but in a city where diplomats, journalists, civil society leaders, and business circles do not live. The political and media battle is of prime importance there. It was there, and it's not really a surprise that the country are states and regions. Information reaching us from the province is often
Yes, so we're losing you, Ambassador. The connection is still not very good. Perhaps we'll invite you back again, and then at a later stage. And now I'd like to give the floor to Tansi, Dato Seri Syed Hamid Abba. In addition to your many other ministerial posts, you were the foreign minister of Malaysia between 1999 to 2008 and took part in the formulation of ASEAN policies during a crucial period in Myanmar's political transition. So how do you see the regional implications of the situation, especially for ASEAN? Your Excellency.
Thank you, Yasak, as the moderator, and Dr. Srakiat and Professor Satin and members of the panel. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers for including me in this course. I just like to mention a few points. I think they have been touched by our colleagues previously. I think there are two ways of looking at Myanmar. Because Malaysia, when Myanmar became a member of ASEAN, Malaysia played a lead role in bringing Myanmar into ASEAN. And I think ASEAN at that time somehow or other we had a vision of wanting to have South Asia geographically complete. With 1997, when Myanmar came in, ASEAN became 10 ASEAN members. But I think the history of, I look at it this way, we have always taken the approach with Myanmar. There is a lot of suspicion of being together or to be collectively responsible. They have always taken a very, because of the over 50 years of military rule, keeping themselves to themselves. So they have been very, very cautious. So ASEAN, because of the way that we look at things, we consider the best approach towards Myanmar was cooperative and non-confrontational. This has been all the way up to now. If you look at the statement of ASEAN, even at the time of a military coup, we asked for dialogue and reconciliation. Immediately with that sort of statement, I think what my friend Ramos said, Myanmar does not have to worry about ASEAN taking a very strong position. ASEAN is interested to see that we can bring Myanmar back into our... So I think we are looking at it positively. I think we shouldn't just look at Myanmar's entry negatively. It's a credit to ASEAN that Myanmar has not been disruptive in the organization. And it participated well in the work and activities, including when we drafted our Asean Charter, when we established ASEAN Human Rights Body, and we approved numerous ASEAN Declaration documents since becoming a member. But Myanmar realized, though, ASEAN has got this consensus and non-interference policy, non-interference principle. Myanmar's general disposition, in my view, if you look at it now, you have to look at the background of it. General disposition is to continue to be independent. And it lacks regard or respect towards the organization for leadership or economic existence. And this made it more difficult for ASEAN to exercise influence on Myanmar. So I think the record of ASEAN with Myanmar, when our initial stage was we championed the cause of Aung San Suu Kyi's freedom, the cause of human rights and democracy. We succeeded in that case. But ASEAN has not been successful in the Rohingya issue in Myanmar. And the military has also disregarded international opinion. And I think this is clearly demonstrated by the fact that on the day that Parliament is supposed to be convened, they arrested Aung San Suu Kyi and her colleagues. So I think that's how, so I think now, in my view, the most difficult thing is, even though the Security Council has said that they want ASEAN to play a core central role, but ASEAN at present has been sidelined, and it is to the military junta. It is Myanmar. I don't think it matters to them whether they are with the organization or not with the organization. There is no way that we can suspend Myanmar, we can expel Myanmar because our charter do not provide the exit. So this is very, so I think I tend to agree with our friend from the BBC that actually in Myanmar maybe our approach, what next, what should we do, is we must not look at the political or the diplomats, even though we are exercising quiet diplomacy. The most crucial, fundamental decision makers are the military. So we must look at the military connectivity in ASEAN. And I think at present it is Thailand. But unfortunately, if it is Thailand were to take the lead, Thailand consider this totally an internal matter of Myanmar. So if this is so, then it will be very difficult. So I think there is need a lot of to act together. I think now Myanmar, definitely Myanmar is now challenging the credibility of ASEAN. So it is important for ASEAN to take the lead. Whether it likes it or not, ASEAN has to take the lead because it is in our area, it is in our household, it's in our doorstep. Yes, we can go back to the roadmap. I think the military would like to have a roadmap. I think when they say they need 1 year, I think they want to give the roadmap. They wanted to follow the Indonesian model, but somehow or other that does not work with the. So I think now the only thing that the military has misread this time, it is no longer the issue of an LD or the issue of Aung San Suu Kyi. Now, the people have tasted democracy. They have tasted freedom. And they have been exposed to the outside world. So if you look at the demonstration, and I think it's, I feel very elated about the demonstration because the protesters, peaceful civil disobedience, we never expect that to happen in Myanmar. They have always been fearful of what the military can do. And now the military has given a warning that they will use further violence in order to stop this demonstration. So I think maybe they have misread with the people demonstrating with civil disobedience is not going to stop until they are able to be brought to the table for national reconciliation, for them to talk what is the roadmap, how they can exit from the current military coup, military rule, back to the civilian rule. I think we have passed the Aung San Suu Kyi period. It is the period of people wanting freedom and democracy. And this is an important stage of it. So ASEAN, as it is, we need to bring together our diverse opinion, our separate position. I think in ASEAN, there is no position on Myanmar. There is no collective position. But yet we have to do something because it is for the sake of ASEAN and its future, not to be shown as a cohesive and solidified body for ASEAN to come to the center. And I think now Indonesia and Malaysia and some other countries, they are taking the lead to get engaged and have dialogue with the military. So I hope this will be successful. Otherwise, Myanmar can no longer say that it is going to be an internal affair of Myanmar, because I think this turmoil and violence is going to have a spillover in the countries or in the region. So Malaysia is facing problem, Thailand will face problem, so all of us will face problem. It is in our best interest to see that we find a way forward to get everybody together. I think Surakyat has mentioned quite a number of steps that can be taken, and I think this should be discussed further for us to look at a more concrete step. Words is not enough. I think we have made a lot of words, and I think we should congratulate the US and the European Union on their sanctions and all sorts of things, but make sure the civilians do not suffer. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. On the role of ASEAN, being so crucial, I'd like to turn to Ambassador Ong Keng Yong, who was the Secretary General of ASEAN between 2003 2007. I'm sure that the question of ASEAN centrality has been something that you've given a lot of thought to. And during your time as Secretary General, the issue of Myanmar figured prominently in ASEAN's relations with our major dialogue partners. So what will be the fallout this time? And again, what role can ASEAN be playing? Master Ong?
Thank you, Ambassador Siasa. I hope you can hear me.
Yes, we can.
Well, I was pondering about your question the other day on what happened to the Myanmar account during my time as Secretary General of ASEAN. I was Secretary General of ASEAN for 5 years from 2003 to the end of 2007. And actually, I thought there are quite a few important factors comparing our time now today vis-a-vis the time when I was at the ASEAN Secretariat. And the immediate preceding speaker, Minister Syed Hamid, had touched on a few of these elements which I thought are important for me to share with all of you. I think the first thing that we put across to Myanmar during my period as Secretary General was that Myanmar is regarded as part of the family, part of ASEAN, and whatever we do, we try to make sure that we do not unwittingly isolate Myanmar further. And along the way, we encountered quite a lot of obstacles, but the overall sentiment which I gleaned from the interaction with the Myanmar military leaders in my 5 years was that they became convinced that ASEAN member states, ASEAN as an organization, was not really out there to follow what non-Southeast Asian countries are advocating. We as ASEAN want to help each other to move forward. So even when there was the difficult decision by New Zealand not to recognize Myanmar as the ASEAN coordinator for the ASEAN-New Zealand dialogue, we in ASEAN found a way to go around that. Sure, for 3 years, the ASEAN-New Zealand dialogue was not hosted or chaired by Myanmar, but the ASEAN side continued to keep the dialogue going using the ASEAN Secretariat, using the Secretary General of ASEAN to bring together the necessary meetings and official interaction. And throughout that period, we make sure that Myanmar send their officials to attend the ASEAN-New Zealand dialogue. So my first point is that ASEAN as a group must continue to impress upon the leadership in Myanmar today that ASEAN is not following the crowd and trying to blame Myanmar military or wanting to follow what other developed countries want to see an outcome in Myanmar today. The second point was really about engaging Myanmar. During the 5 years I was Secretary General, we were very sincere in all our effort. We did not say that, because you are giving us all this trouble, we treat you like a second-class member. We maintained our processes, we kept to our established protocol, and we did not in any way, during the 5 years when I was Secretary General, show that Myanmar was different because of the trouble it brought to ASEAN organization. So going forward today, I think what we need to do is, as some of the preceding speakers have put across, demonstrate that what we are now confronting in ASEAN as a result of the latest development in Myanmar will actually slow down our ASEAN community building. And what we are trying to say about the situation in Myanmar today has nothing to do with we in ASEAN country taking a position with regard to the ideology or with regard to the policy in Myanmar. Rather, what we are trying to do is to make sure that all the world continue to treat ASEAN as the dynamic organization that we have been shown to be in the past 10 years or so. So this is important for the purpose of hoping that we can continue to engage the military leadership in Myanmar and to develop the roadmap that Minister Surakiart talks about earlier on. The final point I wanted to make is that during my time as Secretary General, the 5 years from 2003 to 2007, there was a very unique character in the Myanmar story, and that was Aung San Suu Kyi. So many people around the world considered Myanmar to be a military-run government, everything was controlled by the military. But there was a campaigner called Aung San Suu Kyi, and she came across as the future for the people of Myanmar. And there is a chance that if ASEAN diplomacy and other diplomatic move by the ASEAN partners and the rest of the world could make progress, then Aung San Suu Kyi could be the person bringing about the democratic change or the transition to democracy. Today, as you heard Larry Jagan say just now, there seems to be a discredit imposed on Aung San Suu Kyi's move post-November 2020 election. But I think today, without the popular icon that Aung San Suu Kyi used to portray, we have another important character in Myanmar. And this is the young people of Myanmar. I do not know about your impression, but from my observation, today the protesters are mostly young, dressed in non-traditional clothes. In the old day, the demonstrators were all in the traditional Myanmar garb called the longi. Today, you see the young demonstrators on the street using placards written in English, and they are all very, very much like any one of us outside of Myanmar. And all of them are savvy, and in spite of all the disruption the government in charge can impose on the connection with the outside world, the internet generation is able to reach out to people outside. Either they go by patching their mobile phone with neighboring countries, VPN or whatever. But this is the most important difference between today and those days back in the early 2000s. That is, the young generation of Myanmar, like the rest of the world, they are internet savvy, they are conscious of the role they can play in determining policy and the future of the country. And if the Myanmar authorities choose to take the traditional line, then I'm afraid there will be more bloodshed, there will be more violence, which will lead to a very difficult position. So I hope that this particular dimension of the situation in Myanmar can be recognized by whoever is in charge, and maybe while we may not be having an Aung San Suu Kyi, we are in a post-Aung San Suu Kyi era, but there is a bigger group of people who are really more important to the future of the country. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ambassador Ong. And now I'd like to give the floor to Mr. Michael Vatis-Kiotis. He's a well-known journalist covering affairs of the region for many years. You are now the Director General for Asia of the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue, an organization whose goal is to support dialogue, mediation, in conflict resolution. Now, from your perspective, what can be done, if any, to bring about the conditions for dialogue and reconciliation in order to return Myanmar back on the democratic path? Michael.
Thank you, Kun Siasak. I won't go over all the good suggestions that have been made to date. I will actually make a pitch for something a bit more radical. And I think, as has been said by a number of speakers, I think the basis for engagement has to be regional and driven by ASEAN. And I would like to note in this regard the boldness with which Indonesian Foreign Minister Retno Marsudi has actually recently conducted a round of shuttle diplomacy. And we should bear in mind that the situation in Myanmar is complicated by the complete absence of face-to-face diplomacy in this region for over a year, which means that all the persuasion that could have gone into discussions with the Tatmadaw from Indonesian friends, from Thai friends, simply hasn't happened because there's all the 10 countries have been isolated and have been unable to be in touch with each other except on virtual platforms like this. The problem is that candid conversations between officials don't happen on virtual platforms, and there's been a very urgent need for the restoration of face-to-face diplomacy, which is something that Ibu Retno herself has taken in hand and I think shown the way. Secondly, I think it's important to recognize that despite all the difficulties that Myanmar has had with ASEAN over the years, progress has been made, at least since 2008, in doing something that in many ways ASEAN doesn't do in any other country, which is to actually get involved in some of the problems on the ground, and more importantly, to be given a mandate to do so, which is something that not all ASEAN countries are comfortable with, because of course it sets a precedent for ASEAN involvement or even intervention in another country. But if you list the number of times in Myanmar this has happened, Cyclone Nargis in 2008, I believe that Nolin will probably talk about that. Also, more recently, the setting up of a very, very unprecedented ASEAN ad hoc team to look at the preparations for repatriation of Rohingya refugees, I think and the role of the ASEAN Humanitarian Assistance Center just before that ad hoc team was set up, I think is an important precedent and one that can be repurposed and used to actually help and assist in Myanmar on the ground when it comes to the restoration of democracy. And that may sound sensitive, but I think in things like supporting a reorganized election commission, for instance, is something that is not beyond the bounds of possibility, because of course all ASEAN states would support the conduct of well-organized elections that are freely and fairly conducted. So I think that's the first point, is that ASEAN has to lead the way, is leading the way. I believe that Ibu Retno will be in Bangkok tomorrow and on Wednesday. I think that's a very important move. The problem you are going to face is that when you try to bring ASEAN ministers together to discuss this issue, which I think can be done by not targeting Myanmar, but by suggesting perhaps that it is time for all 10 foreign ministers to meet and discuss a number of regional developments, you're going to find some resistance, because in the case of Vietnam, for instance, the foreign minister, if he traveled to Indonesia or another country, would have to spend 2 weeks in quarantine when he gets back in his own country, which of course further handicaps the role of diplomacy. And I think so quite apart from anything else, the incredible paralysis that we all face in this region to address any of the important issues, including, of course, COVID-19, makes it very difficult to actually imagine how you can proceed with dialogue on an effective basis. Lastly, I will just say that I do think that it's important to use vaccine and COVID-19 diplomacy in this context as well. I know for a fact that Myanmar is very concerned about being caught between India and China in terms of the supply of vaccine. And this is another way in which ASEAN can sort of, I think, make a move to show that it is assisting the Myanmar people, not necessarily the military junta, but the Myanmar people in using the COVID-19 vaccine fund that ASEAN has set up, modest as it is, to establish a supply which I think can be done from Thailand, which is a manufacturing hub for vaccines. So that, more and more there can be involvement by ASEAN in Myanmar as the situation, which I think we've all agreed is very unpredictable, unfolds. I'll leave it there. Thank you, Kun Siasak.
Thank you. Thank you, Michael. Now we have two additional speakers, both leading women and with extensive experience in Myanmar. They were not on the original list of speakers, but we are glad that they could join us. First, we have Ms. Nolene Hazer. She was the Under-Secretary of the UN and the first woman to serve as the Executive Secretary of UN ESCAP, the Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific. She is currently a member of the UN Security Council's High-Level Advisory Board on Mediation. Nolene, can you share with us some of your views on Myanmar situation going forward? You have to unmute first. You're on mute. You have to unmute your microphone. We can't hear you. There must be yes, you're on mute now. Nope. Okay.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, now.
Okay, good. Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador, and thank you to the co-chairs and all the esteemed colleagues for all your thoughts on this very, very important subject. And first of all, let me stress that we all have agreed that the military is not a legitimate government. And even the elections that they promise in the year now will not be quite legitimate. And they can't govern with the people against them on this kind of a scale that everyone has spoken about. And they can't govern when essential sectors of the country have actually collapsed, from the healthcare sector in the midst of the pandemic to the economic and livelihood sectors in the midst of terrible economic hardships. It's very, very clear that people want a very different future. It's the youth, it's the women, but it's basically most of societies, especially the people who have been so vulnerable. I mean, you still have a situation where despite the economic growth, the wealth has been concentrated in the hands of the military. And you have endless numbers of people, even if just in Thailand alone, you have 2 million low-wage workers and 4 million undocumented workers. And therefore, I mean, this situation basically is really, and many people have said this already, is actually the military against its own people. And if you look at the protests, one of the slogans that I saw is that we do not want a supreme leader. The population would not want to go back to military rule. And whatever it is, they see Aung San Suu Kyi as being able to provide a possible road to a future, even though it's difficult, and it's not like she has had an easy time, nor they have had an easy time under her current government. But at the same time, there are spaces that they can actually use, and they hope to be able to move some of these agendas forward. So what is to be done? I think many people have spoken about ASEAN. And at the time when I was the executive secretary of ASCAP, we, together with Dr. Surin and the ASEAN foreign ministers, we played a major role in trying to ensure that ASEAN will be a bridge during the time of Cyclone Nargis in order to provide humanitarian assistance. I think, where are we now and what is to be done? I think currently the movement in ASEAN is being led by 4 countries, and that's not enough. We can't have just Indonesia, Malaysia, Brunei, and Singapore. I think it is critical that we bring Thailand in, but also Philippines and Vietnam. Vietnam is a member of the Security Council. And Mr. Chair, I just want to say I am actually on the high-level advisory board of the Secretary General, not of the Security Council. So the point is that ASEAN needs to come together in a much stronger way. And I know for sure that they are trying to have an emergency foreign ministers meeting, but that's not moving forward. So hopefully the shuttle diplomacy that Ibu Ratno is engaging will allow this to happen. And it is critical that it happens, because if we look at Cyclone Nargis, there were 2 foreign ministers that stuck to the bottom line to get the military onto the table. We need to have channels to the military And obviously, the ASEAN military will have to play the role, but at the same time, the heads of states of ASEAN will have to play a major role, and also the foreign ministers will have to play a major role. And there has to be a bottom line. There was a bottom line during Cyclone Nargis, and we need to find that. Now, what are we asking for? Firstly, we have to prevent and stop any further escalation of military violence. You cannot have an ASEAN country killing its own people, and that's not acceptable in any condition. And that has got to be made clear. It is a bottom line. And I think many people have mentioned this, including our co-chair, and this is to try to set up a process or a mechanism of dialogue. I think we have to understand the nature of Myanmar at this particular time. There is just no way that we're going to have a pure civilian government. The road to democracy is along a trajectory, and there maybe have to be some discussion of power sharing in a way that takes into account, whatever issues on both sides. But this means building trust and building really, really deep trust in order to even start that conversation. And therefore, besides the shuttle diplomacy, we have to have a very quiet diplomacy done by resource people in ASEAN who have actually channels to both sides, and try to really get that going in order to look at how to set up at least the framework of the first set of conversation. I think at the end of the day, even if we manage to get there, there has to be a team. And I've done this negotiation work for many other conflict situations in Africa, in the Middle East, and so on. You need to have a resource team of negotiators and mediation and mediators. And here we can include the youth and the women and other people. But again, it doesn't have to be visible. It can be quiet. But at least there is a link to what the people want. And at the end of the day, what is it all about? I mean, we have to make sure that we're clear that what we are about is actually power sharing or the road to democracy or something, and which is what? It is building the economic and social foundation for the people who are really, really frustrated. And this, their situation cannot go on. I mean, you cannot have a country that is so divided, and you cannot have a country where the elites take all. So basically, it is really a mediation with the interests of the people, but how do you share power and structure that in a way that some of the power stakeholders are able to at least work together to allow that to happen. And I just would like to actually, I know I should end soon, but at the end of the day, there are so many examples in ASEAN itself from within Indonesia and Timor-Leste, the Aceh situation, you have the Philippines situation. There are so many places where we know how to contain sub-regional conflicts. And I think we need to actually draw and pull together and harness the resources that exist within ASEAN. And as we talk, I just want to say that I know that Habib Abba is listening, and thank you for whatever you have already suggested, which is very, very valuable. But I would also say that at this particular time, it is important that we do not legitimize the coup by sending undocumented workers from Myanmar back to the country. And I know that there's about 1,200 people of Myanmar nationality that are being deported. And I think we have to, at least in ASEAN, to actually stop that for the moment, and then try to address some of these very critical issues. So let me stop there, because I know that many other people would like to speak as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Noreen. Our last speaker for this round, first round, is Ms. Janelle Safin. She has served in state and federal Australian parliaments and in many leading capacities. Significantly, she formed and chaired the Australian Myanmar parliamentary group. She has worked with many Myanmar organizations in the past, and I'm sure that she has many insights to share with us. Janelle, please.
Thank you, Ambassador. And I'll share some of my observations and work to lead to the question about what can ASEAN do. And I've appreciated everybody's comments, observations, and following from Nolene. Nolene, I won't repeat what you said, but I concur. So thank you as I follow on from you. And firstly, we have to be really strong, whoever we are, and if it's ASEAN or the APRC, as Dr. Sarakiat's indicated, that we don't tolerate any violence, any military violence, because that has to be a clear message. And even the Chinese ambassador in a statement in Yangon has also said that as well, that violence should be avoided and basic rights of people should be given. And Ambassador Chen Hai also talked about the civil disobedience movement, and it's all in, his written statement as well, and said he recognised their aspirations and their reasonable demands. And that was quite a statement to come from Ambassador Chen Hai, to say it publicly. He also said he understood, in a sense, why they were outside the Chinese embassy and they were there. So I think that's one thing. And that we just have to be really clear about that, because nobody can tolerate if the military really turns on the people. And that point about war, the military has been, or the Tatmadaw at the higher levels, they've been at war with the people for decades. And this is a continuation of that war, and it is a coup. And I know the UN, the Security Council resolution recognised that it was a state of emergency, but it's a coup, and I think we can call it a coup because it's a coup. And without going into the finer details, but I have quite a lot of constitutional Myanmar expertise, it's clearly a coup. And they illegally got rid of the president so that they could install Vice President Min Shui. What Larry said about Suu Kyi and the young people, I don't agree entirely with that, Larry, because the young people want democracy. They feel it's being stolen from them. They're angry but peaceful, and they feel something's been stolen away, and they see Suu Kyi, or Ama as they call her, as best able to represent that. And the Min Aung Hlaing and the generals got worried over a number of things, but one was when the NLD reached out, their first political act post-election was to reach out to the ethnic nationalities. And the ethnic nationalities started to come on board with them. And that's a group that has been sort of captured within the peace process with the military, with the Tatmadaw. And that unnerved them as well. So there was that aspect of it. Their relationship with China is sometimes not what people see, that is with the upper echelons in the Tatmadaw. And the Ambassador Chen also said he had good relationships with Aung San Suu Kyi, the NLD, and with the Tatmadaw. So that was further in the statement. But what leverage has ASEAN got? And for ASEAN does have leverage because it's there, it's part of it. The Security Council resolution recognised it, but it would have to muscle up to use some of that leverage. It doesn't have to be megaphone diplomacy. It can be that sort of quiet diplomacy. It has to be structured, it has to be resourced, as Noeline said, and it has to be quite deliberate. What is it that we're trying to, or ASEAN is trying to achieve? And then there's ASEAN partners, and you've got China and Japan's got a role. I know that's not ASEAN, but they do have the linkages. So there's some of the things that could be done. Some of the other leverage, and General Min Aung Hlaing has said his priorities, and he articulated them, and it was foreign policy would stay the same. Investment and finance, and particularly foreign, would stay the same. I see that as leverage because they don't want to lose that. He did say elections in a year, we'll see, and I think hold him to his word if it gets to that. But last time it was 28 years, then 20 years after the military said elections would come. And he also talked about repatriation of Rohingya, so he actually said it. So I think we have to look at what he's saying, but particularly investment and finance, and putting U Ong Nai in as the investment minister. He's trying to send a signal, and U Koko Line as international cooperation. So he's got those two there. Part of our messaging is it can't be business as usual with the coup running things the way they do, and that foreign investment will stay exactly the same. Some of the investors there have spoken out and issued a statement. And also we have the oil and gas sector, because with Thailand we have the PTTEP, there's POSCO Korea, Petronas Malaysia, Woodside, Total, Chevron. And I think there can be quiet talks with them as well about using some of that investment leverage. They're not going to leave, they're going to stay there, and they've been, Chevron and Total have been there forever. But we can use that as well. And the other, we talked about General Min Aung Hlaing definitely wants a role in politics himself. He was about to be soon retired out. That could have been extended in some way. And he made it clear that he did want to be there. And the military already constitutionally have a clear role in the national politics. It actually says it in the Constitution. And they're the safeguarders of the Constitution. It's in there, Article 20. So they already have a big role. He wanted something beyond that, and I think what he wanted was something like more functional representation with other groups, and was worried about where the ethnic nationalities were going. But what ASEAN can do, and ASEAN, if it muscles up, makes it clear, like Foreign Minister Retna's been doing, I think it can play a role. Otherwise, it will be more constructive engagement, for want of a better phrase, and constructive engagement in the old way just won't work with them. Thailand has a close relationship, military to military, as well, and Dr. Sarakiart and our other Thai friends know this very well. That can be utilised, and even with the Prime Minister. So ASEAN and definitely Thailand, and reaching out there. There's just a few other points that I could make, but I'll probably leave it there, just given the time and the fact that we've heard from everyone. But it needs to be structured, it needs to be strong, it needs to be deliberate and sustained. And coming from ASEAN, and APRC can certainly play a role, Dr. Sarakiart as well, in trying to support and resource that process. And people like myself, and there's a whole lot of us, happy to stay involved in some way in the background, helping. I still work for UNDP in Myanmar, so I work in the parliament and in the machinery of government, so I've worked with the military as well, and with the military MPs, so I've had quite a bit of experience with them, working as friend, but everybody's trying to work out what do we do now, and we do have to tell them it's not okay to do a coup. And three things that embolden the Tatmadaw was the West turning on Suu Kyi. They saw her power base weaken in their eyes over the Rohingya, and also they watched Thailand experience as well, which is far more benign, than how the Myanmar military act, but they were watching that and having that discussion. And during the elections, and Larry would know this, I know, we both know, it did embolden General Min Aung Hlaing a little bit more watching President Trump and about the whole election fraud. So there were a few things that emboldened, but look, I'll leave it at that, and I do hope ASEAN can step up and we can help support it as well. The West will do what they do. They'll do the sanctions, they'll do those things. We won't have much control over that, and they'll work through it, and they have to. But we do have to tell them they've been bad boys in some way. Thank you.
Thank you, Janelle. We've now listened to all the speakers. We've covered a lot of grounds. I think we've discussed about the domestic situation in Myanmar. Our main concern, of course, is how to prevent violence from breaking out. I think the point that was also made that perhaps the military underestimated how the situation has changed now that the people have tasted democracy. And so how to promote dialogue? The time is perhaps not yet ripe for a dialogue, but the international community must and have to stay engaged. We cannot turn our backs on Myanmar. And in this regard, ASEAN, I think all of us agree that ASEAN has to play a leading role. And of course, ASEAN has been limited by this principle of non-interference. But if you set aside, democracy and internal affairs, the point was made that the ramification of what's happening in Myanmar has effect on ASEAN as a whole. So there are indeed grounds and justification for ASEAN to be more active with regard to the situation in Myanmar. And Foreign Minister Retno is now engaged in shuttle diplomacy, trying to convene a special meeting of the ASEAN foreign ministers, using perhaps COVID-19 pandemic as the entry point. But many of the speakers agree that Thailand should, as a next door neighbor, and given all the ties we have, the connections that we have between the two governments, the military, perhaps, it's time for Thailand to play a bigger role. And so these are the issues that we discussed. I think in the second round, we could go in greater detail on some of these issues. And to kick off the second round of discussion, I'd like to give the floor to His Excellency Ramos-Horta. Are you still there, Your Excellency?
Yeah, I'm still here.
Please.
I do have much to say, and I thoroughly disagree with the narrative by Larry, saying it about it is not NLD, it's not Suu Kyi. Well, then what's the point of having elections? Elections are organized through party system. In a democracy, elections, parties are led, and Suu Kyi and NLD won. To the dismay of the military, to their miscalculation, and she won even more than before. And to say, well, it's a new development that young people are leading the demonstration in Myanmar. Well, they always led the demonstrations over the years in the past. And as in Indonesia, it was the young people who brought down Suharto 20 years ago. So nothing new. It's always the young people. The young people that did made revolution in France and everywhere. Not the older people on wheelchairs that lead revolution. So nothing new about that. The fact of the matter is the Myanmar military, they learn lessons from Thailand. I'm sorry to say so to my Thai friends and colleagues sitting there. They learned the lesson from Thailand. The military orchestrated coup after coup. Then they did a roadmap, as you were suggesting for Myanmar. The military worked out a roadmap, a new constitution, and the general who orchestrated the coup became prime minister. So that was very inspirational to the military in Myanmar. So that's the point. So if there is no firm attitude on the part of the international community, well, a year from now, yes, we will have an election, or maybe they postpone, like it was postponed a number of times in Thailand. And the question is, but for me, watching from afar, and I've been to Myanmar many times, it's not only in recent years. First time ever I went to Myanmar was during the military. I was there in July '94, illegally, conducting a human rights training program for all nationalities in the jungles of Manipur. And ever since, I'm familiar with it. And the fact is, ASEAN, the UN, might all be led by the people of Myanmar, meaning catching the train, rather than really be central, rather than really try to be part of the process. We are slow, the international community, and the people are not going to wait. And when we talk about violence, the only people engaged in violence through history of the Myanmar and other countries are the military, those with weapons. The people of Myanmar, the youth, the women, the professionals, the intellectuals, they are all demonstrating peacefully. And if they continue in a sustained manner, well, the military are the ones responsible for the economic degradation of Myanmar, not the people. We cannot invoke the problems of economic difficulties, deteriorated economic difficulties because of strike, because of demonstration. No, this is their right. And the sacrifices that they have been enduring for 50 years, and they will continue to do, so that those they elected govern or misgovern. It's also their right to do it. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency. Perhaps at this stage, I'd like to give the floor to Dr. Surukit for his comments.
Well, thank you very much, Ambassador Sihasak. I think all of us have agreed, although with different focuses, that ASEAN must be playing a leading role. The question is, what kind of role ASEAN can play, and who in ASEAN should be playing it? Minister Alba and I, we have been talking about, over 10 years, we go back to the word release of Aung San Suu Kyi and national reconciliation, right? We drafted this 15 years ago, and we are doing it again. But it's not that much that foreign ministers of ASEAN can do. Learning from the lesson, I think we have to get the heads of state, heads of government of ASEAN to be involved. Minister Rednow's charter diplomacy is to be welcomed. But it must be the heads of state and heads of government of ASEAN. Of course, they don't have to issue any statement, but they can give a green light to ASEAN armies, ASEAN militaries, to be in communication with the Tatmadaw. I think that's the way forward. In my experience as the chairman of the advisory board for the Rakhine state, I have to also communicate with Myanmar Tatmadaw through the Thai military armed forces, for example. And I'm sure that Malaysian armed forces, Filipino armed forces, and others, Vietnamese armed forces, they have relationship with Myanmar Tatmadaw. Many of us have been talking about confidence building and trust, and I fully agree. it is this confidence and trust, the confidence building mechanism of ASEAN, that in the case of this coup d'etat in Myanmar, that the confidence and trust can be instituted through the relationship among the military of ASEAN. Singapore military also has a relationship. I have to admit that the Thai military probably have the closest relationship with Myanmar military at the moment, especially when our government, although it is a civilian government, it went through election, but the Prime Minister was Chief of the Army before. And people working with him used to be Supreme Commander of the Thai Armed Forces. So in the case of Thailand, it is one of the very few occasions where the so-called civilian government and the Thai military can act as one. So I think that if we can speak with one voice that yes, ASEAN foreign ministers, all the stakeholders in ASEAN working together, but we have to send a message to heads of government and heads of state of ASEAN to give green light to the ASEAN military leaders, armies, to be creating comfort level with Myanmar Tatmadaw, to be creating trust and confidence building process with the Tatmadaw. And I fully agree with many of our friends who have said that we need a quiet diplomacy. We did that before, right, Syed Hamid, in the past. And I think this is something that the military can do quite effectively. We need mediation. I think we need to have another brainstorm session as to when is the time for the mediation. Larry said that it's probably premature at this point, but I think we have to prepare the groundwork for it. The mediation is not something that once we agree we can start tomorrow. It takes time. I think that's one of the issues I just would like to flag out at this point. Secondly, what Syed Hamid has talked about, roadmap, and some of you have talked about as well. The question is, what should be steps in the roadmap? I agree with Jose Ramos-Horta, my colleague, that they followed the Thai roadmap. And the roadmap didn't get us very far towards democracy, at least not as far as many have wanted. But I think that's why we need to work together to see when we talk about roadmap for democracy 1 year from now, clear steps and timeline have to be articulated by the Myanmar administration as to what are the things that would have to be done. And I think with all of us putting resources together, and if we can put this in the hands of our armies as examples as to what are steps that Myanmar military need to spell out to be accepted regionally and internationally. But what is more important in my view is a roadmap for national reconciliation. And of course, the young people, the protesters, have looked at Aung San Suu Kyi as still that democratic icon, which I also agree. They want release immediately of Aung San Suu Kyi. But the more important question is something that several of you have talked about, is that once you release Aung San Suu Kyi tomorrow and the president, and then what's next? Do you think there will be less protests? I think there will be even more protests. They want to go back at least to the status quo ante. Something before February 1, Parliament opened based on the result of the election in November. Whether that can happen? Probably not. So the question that some of you raised is about the content of the national reconciliation. First of all, if Aung San Suu Kyi is released, NLD is back, is that all that protesters, Gen Z, the new generation, even the old people of Myanmar have wanted? I tend to feel that they want something more. Perhaps they want to work with Aung San Suu Kyi and NLD, but they want something more than that. They want to talk about peace process. They want to talk about federalism. They want to talk about constitutional amendment that is seen as a half-lived democracy in the past years. So whether the issue is already gone beyond NLD and Aung San Suu Kyi or not, I'm not sure. But at least I think Aung San Suu Kyi and NLD have to be a part of the process of national reconciliation. So I think the details and mechanism for national reconciliation and how to go forward in order that the concern and the call of the protesters, the new generation, the women, the old generation who have been in the street as well, would be addressed. So I think that is something that we all have to work together. We may not have time now, but I think it is something that all of you, all the lead speakers and those over 200 participants today can carry back to your respective country and talk to all the opinion leaders in your country and see how can we come up with a suggestion for national reconciliation process in Myanmar that address the needs, the concerns of the Myanmar people that we've been hearing in the past 3 weeks. As for Thailand, I would like to say also that Thailand should look at this issue, not the intervention in domestic affairs of Myanmar, not the issue that the Thai government, 7 years ago, there was a coup in Thailand as well. So we should not feel that if we talk about this issue, it will get back to us. I think it's important that Thailand has to look at this as how we can help Myanmar in the future. We should look at this as something that is affecting the interests of ASEAN. If there's more poverty in Myanmar, there will be more people crossing the border. Some of them crossed the border in November, and look, we have the second lockdown. We don't call it lockdown, but it is a lockdown for 3 months. So if we have now 10,000 of them crossing the border because have nothing to do because of the economic hardship, if they cross to Malaysia, to Singapore, the boat people into other countries, what will happen with the pandemic? Secondly, the ethnic minority groups have been in disagreement with the coup. The KNU, the Shan states, all of this, they have armies. If there are clashes again among themselves, something that happened 30 years ago can happen again. Even 30 years past, we still have over 10,000 of the so-called displaced person along the border of Thai and Myanmar. So if there are more people crossing the border, 500,000, some to Malaysia, to Indonesia, to Singapore, how can ASEAN say that it is a domestic issue of Myanmar? It is at the interest of ASEAN, not even counting the reputational risk that ASEAN would have to bear if we don't do anything at all. So I think these are all the issues that I just would like to flag out, and I think that all of you have touched upon some of these issues. I hope that Ambassador Sihasak can sort of put all of these issues together, and perhaps we can circulate among all the lead speakers that perhaps these are some of the main issues that we have agreed today. Of course, it's a Chatham House rule. We would make no reference to any of us at all. But maybe it's a fruitful thought. It's the basis of the work that we can be working together for the next webinar. Thank you.
Would any of the other speakers care to address some of the points that have been raised in the first round, or the points that have been raised just recently by Dr. Surikit, Minister Surikit? Minister Abba, please.
I think the discussion has been very interesting. I think, but when you want to get ASEAN to be involved, to play a central role, there's a lot of nudging and prompting has to be done. In the case of ASEAN, we move at a very glacial speed, or anything that has to do with another member state. So I'm a bit concerned about that, because I think Ratno, actually, Foreign Minister Ratno didn't go as an initiative of a foreign minister. Actually, it was after a discussion between Jokowi and the Prime Minister of Malaysia, and she was given the mandate in Indonesia to play the lead role, and I think with her and to do the shuttle diplomacy. And I think the biggest problem that we are facing is ASEAN, insofar as we need to convince our fellow ASEAN members, as mentioned by Professor Surakiat. You know, at present we have just We have been able to discuss with Singapore, we've been able to discuss with Brunei, and Brunei would take a route that doesn't bring into controversy or conflict, because I think that's the way that so all of them want one dialogue. But I think the military is not going, if we say that they are not legitimate, as we want to see that they are not legitimate, if we are proposing a discussion with the military, then we are accepting their legitimacy. So I think this is a thing that we need to be very careful and conscious. The military is very suspicious. I think the only way, if you want to move with the military, is not the normal military from general to general. I think the fraternity there is very close in ASEAN, as far as I know. It's between the intelligence community of the military. As a former defense minister, I know that, they move quietly and without anybody noticing. And I think it is for us actually to come up with a substantive issue, an agreed position. If we do not come up with the substantive issues, it will be initiated by the military, and we are trying to find a political solution. At the end of it, it is a political solution. So I think here, maybe as my friend Professor Surakiat, Excellency Surakiat mentioned just now, maybe the Secretariat, Sihasak as the Secretary General, quietly we can try to get everything together, our discussion, what are the proposals that we are, and I think there is no way if we talk about Suu Kyi, for them, or we mention about release of Suu Kyi, I think it's a non-starter. Not that I know. In the first place, somebody just now mentioned, I think it's Professor Surakiat, Suu Kyi, if she is released, she will be considered as the inspiration for a bigger protest. So they will not allow that to happen. So I think at present, if you want to make use of Suu Kyi has become the inspiration for the civil disobedience, protests. They have followed her. But I think our roadmap is how do Myanmar go through the journey of democracy. And I think this we have to make it very clear. 1, 2, 3, 4. This is how we would like Myanmar to do. And I think violence is going to increase unless we act quickly. And I think the military is getting very impatient. And we need to make use. Definitely at present, we have to make use the good officers, as Janil just now mentioned, of China. If they are with us, to say at least that the voice of the people must be heard, I think we have a good start. So this is, I think, the way forward. So I think I should stop there. I've got so many more things that I want to say, but I should stop there so that our other colleagues can mention. Surakiat mentioned just now. When I was discussing with Tam Sui at that time when they were transiting, what Tan Sui was telling me at that stage, this is totally confidential. Anyway, what he said then was that when they passed the baton to the civilians and housing, they do not want the military to be marginalized. Or the military, there is a truth commission set up, the military is going to be sanctioned and they are going to be, they will be facing court cases or allegations. So we have to be very careful. And I think at present, I spoke to the Prime Minister of Thailand about the Rohingya issue, about Thailand involvement because of the closeness of Thailand. The Thai Prime Minister's reaction then was, Thailand cannot get involved because it is an internal affair of the internal affair of Myanmar. So that's it. Sorry to take a bit of time.
Thank you, Ambassador Ong.
Chairman.
Yes.
Yeah. I wanted to make 2 points. One is that I think ASEAN, while we respect each of our member states' prerogative, at this particular moment, our priority must be to try to impress upon everybody the need to avoid more bloodshed, more violence. So having to stress in any possible ASEAN statement or comment on what is happening in Myanmar should not deter us from even saying some basic thing like please find some ways to resolve your own differences, but in the meantime civilians should not be shot at and what have you. I think we in ASEAN we reach a point where such things where violence from military power is seen to be exercised will be very earth-shattering to our younger generation of people. Yeah, we have now an ASEAN community since 2015. We don't interfere in domestic politics or internal affairs, but as a community, surely we can say something about finding a way forward without firing at civilians and unarmed young people. The second point I wanted to make is that I think it is important to engage in diplomacy by ASEAN member states, but at the same time, bear in mind that there are people from our dialogue partner group who are more influential in Thailand, in Myanmar. So like some of the preceding speaker mentioned the role of China. I don't think China wants the deterioration to continue. So we should engage them. In fact, this particular session, we are missing one other important country, which is Japan. Yeah. So China, Japan, Australia, together with ASEAN member states who are willing to do more, we are member states of ASEAN, we follow the line. Yeah. However, if those countries can do more, we can engage the ASEAN dialogue partners, in this case China, Japan, Australia, to do something to avoid a stalemate like this, because a stalemate like this will continue and there will be more street protests and violence will happen. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Thank you, Ambassador Ong. I see Larry asking for the floor, please.
Thank you. Just very quickly, there's no question that this crisis is not just a Myanmar crisis. This is a regional crisis. We talk about the possibility of refugees in Thailand. It's also actually going to affect business generally in the region. If Myanmar becomes a pariah state again, if there are sanctions, then businesses in the neighboring countries, particularly Thailand, are also going to be affected. The kind of cooperation that we saw earlier in the last couple of years between Thailand and Myanmar in terms of business is gone. The diplomacy we need is actually on 3 levels: diplomatic, politicians, diplomats, army, military, and business. ASEAN has to take the lead, and someone within ASEAN ought to be the sort of motoring that on, and I believe Thailand is in the best position. It is not time for what I call statement diplomacy or for megaphone diplomacy. Things need to be happening now, quickly, but at a very confidential, quiet level. And there's no doubt that ASEAN cannot do it alone, and in fact shouldn't do it alone. This is a regional issue, and China is crucial. Then there needs to be overtures made behind the scenes with the Chinese. The Chinese are just as concerned as Thailand about security and stability in the northern border with China. Myanmar and China. So there is a lot of mutual interest. So they should be reaching out. I think in terms of a core group, it's actually China, Japan, and India that needs to be working with ASEAN. And if ASEAN takes the lead, China will accept it. I remember talking to the Myanmar diplomats who are based in New York and in Geneva And whenever a motion was coming up to condemn Myanmar, they would go to the Chinese embassy and say, look, will you support it? Will you veto it? And they always said, have you asked ASEAN first? Ask ASEAN first. If you get ASEAN on board, we will follow. And I think we have to use that in terms of moving forward. But quiet diplomacy.
Thank you, Larry. Any other speakers would like to take the floor?
Can I try to jump in the discussions from
Ambassador
Yangon?
Lechervy, please. Yes.
Well, I will try. When we are talking about shuttle diplomacy, I feel there is two preconditions. The first one is the will on Tatmaro's side, and especially at the highest level. And we need to remember that the power in the hand of not so many people is mainly in the hand of one person. And the second precondition is you need an inclusive shuttle diplomacy. That means you need to be in contact with the previous government. But we face two problems in the time being. We have to admit that the first circle of putschists is inaccessible. The main military decision makers do not engage in dialogue with the international community, including ASEAN member states. On the other side, the previous governments and their member of parliament are detained or wanted. And we know there is no solution without the NLD leaders, starting by we are talking about people in the street is not limited to the Generation Z. This is reductive, and journalistic formula might suggest. In the rally of demonstrators, it's possible to perceive several political agenda, and they do have in common the call of respect for the vote cast on November 8th, to see the immediate and unconditional release of the President of the Republic and the State Councillor, and a deep desire to build an authentic democratic country and not go back to past military regime, isolationist and economically inefficient. And finally, on the EU member state, we share this objective. And since the end of January, we haven't said anything else. This is not interference in the international affairs of a sovereign state, that it has been the very heart of our actions and our narrative for nearly a decade. The second element I would like to underline, it's what he just said by Larry. The military coup of February 1st not only upset the legal and the constitutional order, it gave new direction to Myanmar relations with the international community. Military interference in the election has resulted in repoliticizing all form of relation and cooperation with Myanmar. Interstate cooperation is turned upside down. Economic and commercial process deeply affect. As we speak, public and private projects worth hundreds of millions of dollars abroad and will not resume for months, if not years. The temptation to prolong military powers through a truquated electoral device after a year of state of emergency put us, and when I say us, that means the EU member state, but also ASEAN, at risk of a crisis, not of a few months or even few years, but perhaps of a decade. And I think we need to be frank between us. The new Union Election Commissions is not credible at all. And a poll without the main actors of 2020 will be unacceptable. Myanmar has entered a deadlock, and we must get out of it quickly and without the blue flowing anymore. There is no doubt that the political solution to this major crisis will come from Myanmar themselves. The international community can help, but will not be able to take the place of the civilian and military leaders to find the path to the rule of law laid by the civilian government. ASEAN has a special responsibility because of geography, it was said, and its institution, but accepting at the same time a fait accompli of the February 1st would legitimize a power massively rejected by these people and create great and mid and long-term political and diplomatic turbulence with Europe, North America, and Pacific member states. On the European side, I think we need to be very clear. Sanctions are inevitable. Their legal basis and their perimeter are currently being defined between member states. And there are the legal obligation to suspend cooperation projects start with the Myanmar state, public agency, and even private operator. And sanctions against individuals, military or not, public or private entities, economic and financial field are the subject of much debate. They are legitimate, intellectually interesting, but they forget that the most severe and lasting sanctions are done quietly and already. The reputational cost for a business operating in or seeking to relocate in Myanmar has exploded in the last days. Many companies will defer their investment or even relocate them. And we are talking about $100 million. And they do so because the legal environment has become too uncertain, the political situation too volatile, not only on the short term, but also on the midterm. And the main donors hesitant, not to say reluctant. We can mention the World Bank, but also a few other major donors. Relations with Myanmar are suddenly excessively and durably politicized, development aid as well. The envelope for cooperation with is more than $1 billion to the current budget each year, and the majority of this support will be redirected to non-governmental actors or even to advocacy action from abroad, which will mechanically strain interstate political relations a little more. This development can now be done very quickly. Reversing them later will paradoxically be slower. This is why we must quickly find a way back to democracy, allowing the establishment of a fully legitimate civilian government. While there is no solution without the military, we must also agree that there will be no lasting solution without the NLD and its leaders, starting with Aung San Suu Kyi, and that's why it's so important to have contact with them as soon as possible. Some commentators argue that we are back to the 1990s. This is not entirely wrong. Two legitimacy clash. On the one hand, the military arguing that they had the right to do what they did. On the other hand, the CRPH represented the parliamentary elected on November 8. Be careful, however, the Myanmar political game is not only between two institutions, Kathmandu on one side, NLD on the other one. The mass demonstration underline how much a trade union play an important role, even if there is no key leaders in front of the line, do social work influencer, and activists even outside the NLD, but also the ethnic armed groups are not without reacting. You mentioned KIA, KNLA, DKBA, the 10 NSC, and other political groups have also their word to say. This complexity cannot be forgotten in the search for an immediate and a forcefully lasting solution. But unlike in 1990, the Myanmar political question is deeply rooted in the functioning of international institutions, as evidenced this week by the European Union Foreign Affairs Council, the meeting of UN General Assembly, or even a few days ago with a discussion in Geneva, or even a G7. In a way, the coup of the February 1st united or reunited the approach of a significant part of the international community, including 3 member states of the UN Security Council. Over.
Thank you, Ambassador Lechervy. I think we've gone about 15 minutes over the time that we have set aside for this webinar. We had a good and productive discussion, very wide-ranging. I think the message is clear that we support democracy in Myanmar. We support the democratic struggle of the people of Myanmar. And we don't want to see violence erupting. Second, we want the international community must stay engaged with the situation in Myanmar, and not just by making statements alone, but by actions, perhaps sanctions, but diplomacy must also be employed. And ASEAN cannot evade its responsibility when it comes to the situation in Myanmar. It affects ASEAN's credibility. We've underscored that. It affects ASEAN's centrality. And so for this to happen, knowing the nature of the ASEAN way, as Minister Surikit pointed out, eventually we require strong leadership at the highest level from the leaders of ASEAN so that ASEAN can really take action. And perhaps, we have to employ quiet diplomacy, track 2 diplomacy, military diplomacy, whatever, that helps to bring about concrete results. And I think one final point is that it's not just ASEAN alone. Other countries that can play a role, and with stakes in the region, countries like China, Japan, and India should also be part of this effort. So these are the ideas and the issues that we discussed. We will try to bring them together and come up with some concrete proposal and see how we can take them forward. I take this opportunity on behalf of APRC, on behalf of the Faculty of Political Science, Ramkhamhaeng University, to thank all of the distinguished speakers for being with us, joining us, and contributing your ideas and thinking. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Okay, that's it. Hamid. Bye-bye.
See you in Singapore.
Yeah, hopefully.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
I'll get to Kuala Lumpur soon. Daniel, thank you very much.
Okay, nice to see you.
Yeah. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
แต่ที่จริงเขาก็มีไอเดียของเขาเยอะเสียดายตรงนั้นแต่เขาเป็นนักวิชาการ